Hi, everyone. We're so happy to be with you today on the 25th of July. It's already the end, getting toward the very end of July. I always think at this time of year it's getting toward the end of summer, but we still have August to go. Well, we have an interesting article, and under trends today, we are on page 36 of your Advanced Studio Classroom, or maybe you want to find it on your digital device, and we're going to be discussing the eggs of the future. And I have two great panelists with me today in the studio. I am Linda, and I also have
Simon
and Lois here.
And we're all happy to be with you today. So, do you guys eat eggs?
Yes, I do. I do. But you know what, Linda? That's a funny question. It took me a long time to like eggs. So actually, I probably didn't start really eating eggs till I was about 45.
Do you think of where they come from? The conditions that they come from?
Well, I think I do because this was actually a business my grandmother had. So she would involve me a little bit when I was a kid. Maybe that's why I didn't like to eat eggs. But yes, I've always actually thought where eggs come from.
Okay. How about you, Simon?
Yeah, I've actually raised chickens both for eggs and meat, though I never managed to eat any of my own chickens. So I have some experience with chickens and with eggs. Admittedly, though, on a very small scale.
Oh, yeah, you raised chickens on your rooftop, didn't you?
I did for a while, yeah. There's a big trend in Western countries now towards what they might call like having backyard chickens. So a family might have 6 chickens that they kind of raise in their backyard. And I did that on my roof.
Yeah. And I lived my teenage years on a farm, and so we always had some chickens. My mom... We had 100 chickens one year, I remember that, and they were free range. We're talking about cage-free eggs here, which is a little bit different, but, you know, it was a farm, and so the chickens were not in cages at all. They were in a chicken coop, which is what we call a chicken house, where they would go in at night to be protected, like from any... We had wild animals in that area, so like from bobcats or from... weasels
foxes,
or
probably.
foxes.
Yes.
Yeah, there are a lot of foxes came through, things like that. So it's quite different, and things have changed quite a bit. And so we're going to be talking about our cage-free eggs, the future here, and we're going to be looking at an Illinois farm.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, this term cage-free is a bit of a confusing one because it has a very narrow definition. So if you look at the term there, cage-free, it gives you the idea that these are birds that are not in any sort of cage or enclosure. They're just kind of free to do what they want. That's not necessarily true. When we talk about chickens in cages, what they're really talking about is tiny cages of a certain size. And so these are chickens that might actually be in a cage, but it's big enough for them to kind of wander around and follow the natural habits that chickens naturally follow, I guess.
Right. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that and what this term actually means. So great introduction, and let's just get right into our article. So page 36 of your magazine, and we are going to read the left-hand column.
Are cage-free eggs the future? This Illinois farm has produced cage-free eggs for 60 years. Inside a long barn next to rolling fields, Rod Wobena looked out over 12,000 or so brown hens scratching in the wood chips and fluttering onto perches. The chickens have always been cage-free at Phil's Fresh Eggs, headquartered in the small farming town of Foreston in northwest Illinois. One of the first commercial egg farms in the U.S. to market and produce cage-free eggs. Now that niche is vanishing. I always felt as long as there was caged egg production out there, there were going to be consumers that would buy Phil's eggs, said Rod Wobena, 58, who bought the family business from his father Phil in 2002. Now the challenge is, how do I make Phil's eggs different from everybody else that's jumping into the pool?
Well, thank you, Lois. And we are talking about cage-free eggs. And as Simon pointed out before our reading, cage-free doesn't really mean cage-free.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that these are free chickens running
It
wild.
doesn't mean range-free.
Yeah. It doesn't mean free range for that
sorry,
matter. Yeah.
Right. And when I went to look up the images on the internet, some actually are cage-free completely, but they're not, like you said, they're not outside roaming. They're kind of roaming in what I would call very oversized chicken coops. I mean, they're just huge.
Cages, right.
Yeah, but they weren't actually kind of in cages. They were almost like this level building that's for chickens.
Well, I suppose because they have to have roosting, or they call them perches here, but, roosting bars or roosting perches. And actually what I was reading is the normal size for chickens is like 67 inches. And here they're talking about 88 inches. That's what they're talking about when they're talking about cage-free, and which gives them a lot more room to move around in. So, but we're going to be talking about actually how the egg production is done at this farm a little bit later on. But we see here that this is a very large chicken farm of 12,000 chickens.
Wow.
So, and it says that they're scratching in the wood chips and fluttering onto perches in the very first paragraph that we're looking at. But notice they are not doing this outside.
No, not at all.
Well, I mean, we don't want to talk about this too much, obviously, but just to be clear, I think this term cage-free really isn't a definable thing. It just means they're not in the tiny cage.
Right.
So some farmers have these kind of giant, dark, open barns that they're all kind of wandering around in. Some of them might be sort of living in a coop with a fence around it outside. Some might be just living in big cages with a couple of chickens. So there's all kinds of different things that are cage-free, but specifically cage-free is not in tiny little cages.
No, and that's why they've expanded from, I think what I read is that of our Phil's Fresh eggs, their cages are like 88 inches. That's why I brought that up earlier. So they've expanded the size of their cages so the chickens can walk around.
Yeah.
But if you look at the picture here on page 37, this is also inside. This maybe is more what we're thinking of.
Right.
And what you might have in your mind.
And sometimes they'll actually show you that on a program or some kind of newsworthy clip or whatever. They'll show you chickens kept this way.
Right. My niece raised that. Well, they don't have a chicken farm, but she's living on an organic, sustainable farm, and they have chickens in a coop. They're in cages that are not a coop, but cages that are long. The chickens can wander around, but they're movable. So they move them around their yard because a lot of it is farmed for fertilizer.
Oh, very good.
It's quite interesting. So we see here that at Phil's Fresh Eggs, that the chickens have always been cage-free. And this is a 60-year-old business for this family. And it's headquartered in a very small farming town in Foreston in northwest Illinois. So that would be up near Wisconsin, I would think. Mm-hmm. And also I thought it was interesting that this is one of the first commercial egg farms in the United States to market and produce cage-free eggs.
Yeah, so if they've been doing this for 60 years, they've been doing it kind of a lot longer than most big commercial chicken farms. I think it should be said, though, that for most sort of mixed farmers, they'll have a few chickens. And so usually when a farmer has 100 chickens, they don't put them in the tiny cages, right?
No.
And so this is really like a farm that is dedicated to producing eggs, and that's why you see that big number there, 12,000 chickens.
Well, this is a chicken farm. I mean, an egg farm.
And you really want to look for the word battery cage or battery cages, because those are the ones that you don't want your chickens kept in. And when a good explanation of knowing about those cages is, believe it or not, the size of the interior floor of that cage is smaller than an A4 piece of paper.
See,
so that is unbelievable.
I think they're called battery cages because they're about the size of a car battery.
Yes.
If you've ever looked your car.
So, that's how you can identify it. But, Linda, this really helped me because now I'm going to look for eggs that aren't just free range. I'm also going to look for eggs that are advertised back in my home country that say cage-free on them.
Well, I think it's interesting that this commercial farm has been producing cage-free eggs for all of this time. And the next sentence, which is also the third paragraph, says now that niche is vanishing, which means that it sounds like everybody else is getting on the bandwagon.
Yeah, so a niche, of course, is a specialized part of the market that there is some demand for, but only a few people are providing for. And the idea then is that for 60 years, people who have wanted cage-free eggs have been able to get them from Phil's, but maybe only from Phil's, whereas now so many other farms are becoming cage-free. It's fairly easy to get cage-free eggs.
Well, his distribution, actually, I should say, is in Illinois and parts of Wisconsin. So usually when you're talking about egg distribution, it's within a certain area or territory.
Right.
So I think that this is talking about the Midwest area in particular.
Yeah, I know with my grandmother's, when we called them the egg man, came and picked up her supply of eggs, it was sold in a certain county in Ontario, Canada.
Right. But, things are changing, and eggs are moving a lot further out than what they used to because of, the shipping and distribution centers are enabling them to have a farther range.
Yeah, that's right. Eggs are, of course, like milk, sort of a fresh grocery good.
Right.
And so if you don't sell them close to the farm, they go bad faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people aren't really interested, right? I know that with having your farm supplies really close to home, it is a real selling feature, and the things move off the shelf a lot faster.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll tell you, though, there is a big difference between North America and Asia with eggs. Like, you two will be familiar with this idea that eggs are always refrigerated in the West. Whereas here in Asia, they aren't.
Things.
And for years, I avoided eating eggs here in Asia because I was, concerned that they would be bad. But maybe that's just sort of a result of being physically closer to farms and going through less of a processing period. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, me too. I was also quite shocked, especially because when we first came to Asia, we made our own mayonnaise, which means you're using raw eggs. And so you really need to be careful.
Yeah. The only thing I was told when I was first moved here is wash the eggs before you crack them here. So I got into the habit of doing that.
Well,
yeah, eggs in North America do come commercially washed and packed.
Yes. Which is why I've read that they have to be kept refrigerated. Once you wash them, you have to keep them in the refrigerator. If you don't wash them, they don't necessarily have to be refrigerated.
Interesting. But it is a big shock, I think,
is.
for a lot of Westerners who moved to the because eggs really are always refrigerated. Like when you get home from the grocery store, first thing you do is pop the eggs in the refrigerator with the milk.
That's right.
So
well, let's continue on here. We see that Phil, our Rod Wabina, who owns Phil's Eggs, thought that caged egg production was out there, and so there would always be people that would buy them. But now, he said, how is he going to make them different from everybody else that's jumping into the pool? And he does not mean this literally. It's kind of like jumping on the bandwagon. Yeah. So lots of people now are interested in what they call cage-free eggs and this kind of production.
But you do have to look up the percentages. I did look up for my own home country, Canada, and I was pretty alarmed and disappointed because it's actually only 95% of laying hens are 95% are in these battery cages in Canada. The only province that doesn't have that high a percentage is British Columbia at 83%. So I think, we think about, this is changing, but I don't think the percentage has changed as quickly as most of us would like it to.
No, we'll see the percentages for the United States a little bit later on in the article. And let's continue on with our article, too. Let's read the second column on this page. Let's read that first section.
Almost every week, it seems, a major food company, Dunkin' Donuts, General Mills, and Taco Bell recently announces its transition to cage-free eggs, amounting to a monumental shift in the industry. Hens shouldn't be kept in cages that allow less space per bird than a piece of notebook paper, a familiar refrain from animal rights activists that's resonating with consumers and driving companies. Getting to this point hasn't been a matter of simply opening the barn doors and setting the birds free. The movement has pitted the egg industry against animal rights groups, with both sides flinging accusations of bias and wielding science to support their viewpoints.
So we're looking at people jumping on the bandwagon for using what they call cage-free eggs here. And several of them are major food companies like Dunkin' Donuts, which used to be in Taipei, and General Mills and Taco Bell. Those are pretty big chains, but the big one that has decided to change their eggs is McDonald's. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later. And they have all announced that they're going to transition to cage-free eggs. And it says here it's a monumental shift in the industry. And if something is monumental, what is it?
Well, it is life-changing. It is totally different. They've done a 180 to what they were doing.
Right. So it's a major shift or a major change in the industry, meaning the egg industry. It's going to affect the egg industry a great deal. So they feel what, Simon?
Well, they're basically saying that hens shouldn't be kept in cages that allow, basically no space. And if you've seen these cages, you probably will join sort of the cage-free movement fairly quickly.
Right.
Because they are kind of
disturbing.
Yeah, they go on though to sort of mention that in our next paragraph here that the two groups are very much in disagreement, and there are actually a lot of good reasons for this disagreement. So nonetheless, though, when you see it, it's the sort of thing that is upsetting to people, and so there is this growing demand.
Well, if you just look at this page of your magazine, that's an 8 inch by 10 inches, how we're measuring about that. So that's what your chicken in a battery cage is relegated to. Okay, that's what they're talking about. And it's a familiar refrain, so that's one of our words. You see, they hear this over and over again, that's resonating or corresponding closely with consumers and driving companies. This is not companies that drive. It means the companies behind the movement. But, as Simon said, we haven't gotten here by opening the barn doors and setting the birds free, right? What's happened?
Well, I guess a big part of the thing is you have to realize that farmers farm the way they farm because it leads to results.
Right.
So farmers aren't generally, in my experience, like uncaring people who are interested in torturing their animals, right? But they are interested in producing the most they possibly can. And so it's important to realize that these battery things, there is a cost to them. So, for example, chickens can't do natural chicken things. So if you've ever had sort of pet chickens or whatever, they do all of these things, like they like to walk around and like peck at the ground. And then they do these things called dust baths, where they kind of flip over and flop around in the dirt for a little while. And they like to sit up on something like a branch when they sleep. And so when a chicken does all these things, it's like a relaxed, happy chicken.
Exactly. And they're like every bird who lays an egg. They like to nest. And if they don't have the room to nest, that's for them, that's something that they absolutely desire. And for them, it's not a want, it's a need.
But there is a downside to that, too, because I have raised chickens in sort of an open enclosure, and there are major, major disadvantages to that. So, for example, chickens live in a very highly organized social hierarchy, and they are brutal to each other. They peck each other, injure each other, kill each other, eat each other if they're left sort of alone. And so free-range chickens, for example, it's much more likely that they will die. They don't make it to adulthood. They get all kinds of medical and health problems. When sickness comes, they all die all at once. They get attacked by predators like neighborhood cats or dogs or things like that.
That's how you raise these in a city.
So it's, well, even in the countryside, it's a really rough life being free range.
Yeah.
And so farmers would argue that if you keep them enclosed, you can control the food they're eating. You can give them sort of medication. You limit the number of deaths. You limit the chicken bullying. And so often when farmers discuss this, what they're discussing is like size of cage, like how to most effectively get the benefits of keeping your chickens healthy and safe, and also having them be as natural as possible. Whereas people who are just buying eggs tend to think like, free the bird, free the bird. Open the door.
I do want to point out to everybody, remember the second line in the very first paragraph, we're talking about 12,000 hens here, as opposed to your 24 and my 100.
Right.
So we're talking major business here. And I think that it changes. You know, we can say, oh, yeah, my 100 chickens ran free on our farm. Right. But that's a big difference than having 12,000. Lots of bullying.
Well, yeah, and you know, my grandmother had dozens of chickens, and they were laying egg chickens, but she never let them run free. She never did. And they weren't free range. They weren't put in battery cages, though, either. But she had to protect them, and she would use that expression, fox in the hen house, because sometimes we'd go to bed at night, all of a sudden we would hear the chickens just go berserk, okay?
Nuts. Yeah.
They were going nuts, and we all knew somebody better get out of bed really quick because there is a fox trying to get in that hen house. So.
Right.
Yeah. So it really is kind of a question then of like, because these are not like natural wild animals at this point, right? So they do need a lot of care. They need a lot of input. And so I think sort of the industry at large is trying to find a balance.
I agree. I think they are too.
A difficult place to be in, I think.
Well, we have a lot of interesting vocabulary in this last section here. It says that this movement has pitted the egg industry against. So if you pit somebody or something against something, then it means that they're going to be in competition with somebody else. So these two groups are they're against one another. And both sides are flinging. Okay?
Which means throwing.
This is a great... This word has a lot of different meanings here.
I was thinking my mom was saying, quit flinging mud at your sister.
So it means to throw here. So they're throwing accusations in this article, it just means they're saying something. But to fling something means to just throw it around.
That's right.
Like mud at your sister.
Like mud when you're a kid.
How about bias, Simon?
Well, bias, it really is sort of an extension of that term point of view, which is the way you see things or your opinion on something. And the idea here is that when you have a bias, basically, you have your point of view, but it's kind of unfair because it favors you. And so you would see this with animal rights activists saying, of course farmers want to keep chickens in cages to a certain extent. They produce more eggs that way, so the farmers will earn more money. And farmers say, well, you just want them to be free, which is not economically practical. We'd all be out of business.
And they'd all kill one another.
Yeah, and they'd all kill each other.
Well, let's finish our reading here. We're at the bottom of the second column on page 36, a still small but growing industry.
A still small but growing industry. Despite all the recent headlines, cage-free eggs still represent a small slice of the industry. Commercial egg-laying hens laying organic and non-organic cage-free eggs accounted for 8.6% of the 274.3 million commercial egg-laying hens in the U.S. in September, according to data from the Agriculture Department. That's almost double the number of cage-free hens from just 5 years ago.
So we can see that this is still very small, but it is growing. And I frankly think they're overly excited about this because 8.6% is nothing, really.
No, we're not even hitting 10%, are we?
But notice that it doubled from 5 years ago. So 5 years ago it was only 4.3%. Well, we see that they still just represent a small slice of the industry. And usually when we're talking about slices, we're measuring things like in pieces of pie. So it's when you're looking at finances, it's just very, very small. And we have this figure from the Agriculture Department, which is where we got the 8.6. And it's kind of interesting, 274.3 million commercial egg-laying hens in the U.S. in September of last year. So that's still a lot of eggs. 8% is still a lot of eggs. And we can see that, again, it's double from 5 years ago. So they feel that the trend is going to increase in the future.
Right. Well, yeah, it would be quite significant if 8.6 doubled, right?
Right.
Well, and there are shifts even within the caged farming. Like we mentioned earlier, you mentioned that I think you said Phil's uses 88-inch
Right.
cages, right? In the past, things really were really tiny, like batteries. But actually, I have a report here that says they're recommending 67 inches now.
Well,
And
that is the new trend, and then Phil's has gone even bigger.
yeah.
Well, we hope that you will join us again tomorrow. We've kind of run out of time here. We'll be talking another day about cage-free eggs and the possibility of them for the future. And if you have a chance, you might want to read page 37 of your magazine before you listen to the program tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again. Bye for now.
Goodbye.
Bye.